Hi, welcome to Scary Storytime with Jasika. Today's story is called The Hooded Congregation. In her cottage on a hillside, a woman was awakened early one Christmas morning by church bells echoing in the air. When the peal ceased, she peered out the window. It was dark, as it would be until almost noon at that time of year, but far below she saw that the doors of the village church were thrown open and its light was streaming out in welcome. Although she could not be sure of the hour, it was clear that Christmas service was about to begin. In some haste, the woman dressed, wrapped herself in her warmest shawl, and, taking a lantern to light her way, set out down the hill for the church. None of her neighbors were in view, and nothing broke the enveloping silence except the occasional crackle of ice falling from tree branches and the crunching of the snow underfoot. As she neared the little church, however, she heard snatches of singing borne on the air, and she walked faster, spurred by the thought of warmth and companionship. At the open church door, she set down her lantern and composed her thoughts to suit the joyful day. Within the nave were rows of hooded heads. Her neighbors had been more alert than she, it seemed. Intoning psalms at the head of the congregation was a priest, robed not in the pristine white of the great festival, but in indeterminate gray. He looked up at the woman peering into the church and bent once more to his prayers, so that his face was hidden. She crept up the aisle between the rows of chanting worshippers, searching for a place to sit. Then help came. A gentle hand grasped her wrist, and a soft voice spoke into her ear. "This way, dear one." Her rescuer guided her to the front of the church. The singers seated there shuffled sideways on their bench to make room, but such was their intentness on the hymn that not one looked up or greeted her. She sat down meekly, and her guide sat beside her. Having settled herself in the pew, the woman turned to thank the helper, but the words died on her lips. The person sitting beside her had thrown back her concealing hood. The woman recognized the face at once, although it was much changed. It was the face of her beloved sister, whom she herself had laid in her coffin that autumn, before the first snowfall. The sister laid a bony hand upon the woman's arm, and the damaged face twisted into an expression that might have been pleading. It was hard to tell, for the head was little more than gleaming bone, still adorned with pasty shreds of flesh. The lipless mouth stretched open to speak, and a gust of odor, a sweet necrotic scent tinged with the smell of earth, swept across the living visitor. No sound came from the mouth, but all around the woman eddied the most toneless chanting of the clustered congregation. She pulled her arm free from the bony clasp and began to inch across the bench. The figure gestured, and the woman found her voice. "You are the dead!" she cried out sharply. At once, as if a spell had been broken, the singing stopped, and a profound and listening silence settled upon the congregation. Heads turned toward her, hoods fell back. Shufflings and rustlings began, and whisperings without words. The woman felt a hand on her shoulder and jerked around. Behind her, was a gleaming skeleton, and beside it another. All up and down the shadowy rows swayed the figures of the dead. Some, still partially clothed in flesh, she recognized. They were people from the village, or had been not long ago. Here a shoulder blade protruded from the rags of a dress. There, wisps of hair clung to a whitened skull. Some of the figures were no more than bone, and these she could not recognize. Some, no doubt dead longest, had faded to almost transparent shadows. The congregation began to move, drifting in a blind and stumbling sort of way toward the living being among them, hands cupped to ears or outstretched, feeling the air. Her sister's voice sounded again close by. "They have heard you. Run before they find you, for they will have you with them if they can. They hunger for fresh company." And the woman rose, trembling to her feet. She was as quiet as she could be, but each skull turned at once in her direction, and bony fingers pointed. She edged off the bench and stepped into the aisle. The ragged figures, clutching at one another, twittering and clicking their teeth, stretching their faces in gleaming grins, began to close in. Stepping as lightly as she could, she hurried down the aisle, but they swarmed behind her, unerringly following the sound of her footsteps. She ran, smelling the earth smell and the stench of death, and at her back she felt sharp prodding. A hand grasped her shoulder. She shook it off. Fingers clutched at her shawl as she gained the door, and she slipped from the fabric and leaped out into the cold night air. Behind her, a single howl issued from the church, and that was all. Gibbering with fear, she made for her priest's house to find him just awake and preparing for Christmas Mass. After she told her tale, the priest himself, holding his crucifix high before him, led her back to the church. The church was empty and peaceful. The shawl, or what little was left of it, lay near the door. It was torn and clawed, almost beyond recognition. That concludes today's scary story with Jasika. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back again soon with another spooky tale. Have a spooky